So many of the stories that you find in the Bible have undergone multiple stages of redaction since the time they were first written. A good example of this would be the story of Noah. If you read the story of Noah in Genesis chapter 7, you notice something strange is going on. There will be little details that seem to be repeated, though they're slightly different. One such detail would be how many animals went onto the ark. In one sentence, it says that there were two of every kind, an animal and its mate. But then another sentence says that of the kosher animals, there were 7 pairs, so 14. And of the non-kosher animals, there were 2 of each. So we have these conflicting accounts just within a single story, even within a single paragraph. 2 of every animal, or 2 of some and 14 of others. And this contradiction, this discrepancy, comes from the story being edited by multiple redactors. What happened was the story was written down, and then sometime later, after it had been put into the book of Genesis, another editor came along and decided that there needed to be a distinction made between pure animals and unpure, the clean and unclean, even though that would be anachronistic for the story, because they didn't have laws yet about clean and unclean animals, and it actually says that before the flood, people didn't eat meat. And so there would have been no clean or unclean animals because they didn't have the law yet, and they didn't even eat animals at that time, at least according to the story. So this is not only an anachronism, but it contradicts the other statements in the story concerning how many animals were in there. And this comes from being multiple editors involved in a single story. You end up with things like this. And now, the person who went back and added this detail, they didn't think that they were really changing the story. What they saw was that there was a problem. There should have been more clean animals on the ark than unclean. I mean, this was their thinking, because the clean animals were more important. And so, in their minds, they weren't changing the story. They weren't altering the text. In their minds, the text should have said that in the beginning, but didn't. And so when they read the text and saw that it just said 2 of every animal, they saw that as a problem, because obviously there would have been more clean animals than unclean because they're more important. So they weren't changing the text the way they saw it. They were correcting the text. There was a problem and they were fixing it. And so when they made a copy of the text, they added in the details that they thought had been left out. They should have been there in the beginning, they just weren't. And we see this throughout the Bible. Another example of this would be the ending of Mark. The way that Mark ends is that the women go to the tomb, and inside they don't find Jesus, but instead they find, I believe it's 2 young men, or maybe it's 2 angels, I can't remember which. They're told that Jesus isn't there, and so the women leave, and it says that they run off and they tell no one what they saw. And that's how the Gospel of Mark ends. However, if you're looking at your Bible, and at the end of the Gospel of Mark, you then have these post-resurrection appearances where Jesus comes along and he gives the Great Commission or anything else like that. Those scenes were not in the Gospel of Mark. What happened was, after the Gospel of Mark was written, other people came along and tried to write their own stories, such as the author of Matthew. Matthew thought that the Gospel of Mark was good, but he wanted to take it in a different direction. He wanted to Judaize Jesus, make him more like a new version of Moses. And so he inserts all these new details into it, because in his mind he thought that Jesus would have been more Jewish than what the Gospel of Mark shows. And so he writes a new version, and this became known as the Gospel of Matthew. It's not written by Matthew, we don't know who wrote it. But later someone came along and didn't really like Matthew, so they created the Gospel of Luke, which kind of, in a way, refutes Matthew. And then the Gospel of John was written, and about 40 others. Well, in these other Gospels, you have these appearances of Jesus after the resurrection, which would be scenes that were invented by the authors of Mark and Luke and John and the Gospel of Peter and so on and so on. So when someone many years later was making a copy of the Gospel of Mark, they realized that all these other Gospels had scenes where Jesus appears after the resurrection, but Mark didn't. And they thought this was a problem. Not that there were originally no post-resurrection appearances. The problem they saw was that Mark must have been incomplete. Because obviously, if these other Gospels said that Jesus appeared after the resurrection, then it must have happened. And the author of Mark simply didn't know about it. Or maybe the copy of the text they were working from, they thought maybe it was just incomplete. Someone left a piece off. So scribes would just make up a scene to insert at the end of Mark. And they didn't just make up one, they made up, I believe, 4 or 5. And so we end up with like 5 different endings to the Gospel of Mark because different people making copies of Mark felt that there should have been a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. So they made one up. They just inserted it. And they did not see this as a problem. They did not see this as being dishonest. They thought that these scenes must have originally been there, and they were simply fixing the text. Now, of course, there are changes that are made because people believe that the text is wrong, or that they do want to change a belief. And one such change is seen in, I believe, the book of Chronicles. In 2 Samuel, Yahweh comes down and tells King David to conduct a census. But then when David conducts a census, Yahweh gets upset. He gets angry that David conducted a census, and then goes on to punish the entire land of Israel. And the author of Chronicles saw that as a problem. Yahweh was punishing Israel for doing the very thing that he instructed them to do. So they wanted to change that. They didn't like the idea of Yahweh being so petty. So they have a Satan coming in and giving instructions to King David to conduct a census, and then Yahweh punishing David in the land of Israel for listening to the Satan. And so this change was inserted not to correct a problem that they thought had been created by accident, not to insert something they thought had been accidentally left out, but to create a deliberate change because they did not like the way that Yahweh had been portrayed in the original story. And so you sort of have a mix of things. In some instances, people are inserting their own beliefs into the text, which is quite common. Much of Christian and Jewish belief later gets inserted into the text. But you also have people who think that maybe something was left out and they're not actually changing the text. They think they're just correcting a problem that other people had missed.